Well, welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to have Bob Cowie here tonight, who's going to talk to you about Syon, an award-winning publication in Amherst Transactions. Came out, must be a couple of years ago now.
Yeah, 2 years.
2 years ago. Bob was involved, of course, in the excavations there, particularly in the series of Birkbeck training excavations that took place over a series of summers, one of which I can see in the picture that you're all looking at now. It's a very fascinating place, Syon, of course, homes of the Dukes of Northumberland. As part of the excavations, we're digging in the gardens of the 9th Earl and 10th Earl, and the 9th Earl, Henry, was the first of the Percys to occupy Syon House, married into the Devereux family, and then managed to acquire it, tenancy on it from James I, and of course he had a very strange career, becoming implicated in the Gunpowder Plot through his distant relation Thomas, and he was spending many years in the Tower because of it. And his son, the 10th Earl, has always fascinated me. Algernon, he looks the perfect aristocrat. He looked the perfect royalist. He was, I think, master of the King's Navy just before the Civil War, but managed to not to let that make him have a sort of rather neutral career during the Civil War, and one that he survived very well, despite Shine House being shot up by essentially by the royalists heading towards London under Percy. Anyway, they were very fascinating figures, but I don't suppose we'll get much time to look at those tonight. Bob will be looking at the early phases, the pre-Syon House phases, the very substantial abbey that was established on the site in the 15th century, and which came to light through the series of excavations in which Bob participated and, of course, wrote up. But just mentioning the 9th and 10th Earls, I should just finish on the 12th Duke, the current Duke of Northumberland, who is, of course, is the site holder today, who did make money available to Molas to help enable Rob and colleagues at Molas to be able to produce the publication. So I think I've taken enough time, Rob. You're going to talk for about 45 minutes, I think, and then there'll be time for questions. If there are time for question answers, Rob says he's very happy to answer them. So without more ado, over to you, sir.
Thank you. Okay, well, so as Harvey mentioned, we were able to do a lot of the work at Syon due to His Grace the Duke of Northumberland getting access to the site, but also financial support. And I'll mention now, just in case there isn't time at the end, Richmond Archaeological Society helped out during the Birkbeck excavations and indeed the Time Team investigations. There were a few Richmond Archaeological Society members helping Time Team in 2003. So, Syon Abbey is a, just see if I can advance this. Yeah, I've been pressing the arrow and it's not moving. Sorry, if you can just bear with us 1 minute. Oh. I sometimes have this effect on technology. So, we have a very unusual late medieval and Tudor landscape, which is a landscape, in fact, that very much interested Mick Aston of Time Team fame. We have a palace, Sheen Palace, as it was in Henry V's time. And Henry V wanted to establish his dynastic seat here. And we have also, at the same time, he proposed to build 3 religious houses. One of them was a Carthusian house, Sheen Charterhouse, which we see here. And then on the opposite bank, he established a Bridgettine house. More of that later. And also, and we're not sure exactly where, but we suspect possibly down where Syon Abbey was eventually located, a Celestine, a French Celestine house. So there were originally in Henry V's scheme a plan to build 3 religious houses. The Celestine house wasn't a successful project. That was abandoned when Henry went to war with France. So we were left then with 2 religious houses. So we had Sheen Charterhouse and Syon Abbey. And indeed, Syon Abbey was immortalized by Shakespeare in a soliloquy, and I think this is the soliloquy just before the Battle of Agincourt. If anyone's familiar with the Laurence Olivier film, I think it's the soliloquy where he's moving around the camp at night, a little touch of Harry in the night. Dangerous words to say now, I think, in the current climate. Certainly if you're a conservative, well, any MP. Anyway, Shakespeare wrote 2 chantries where the sad and solemn priests still sing. So this is a reference to Sheen Charterhouse and Syon Abbey. Both were well-known establishments, even 40 years after their closure, when Shakespeare was writing, they were still very much in the minds of people. So here you have a modern map of this sort of royal and monastic landscape. We have Sheen Palace, which was renamed Richmond in 1501, Sheen Charterhouse here, and then we have, I should mention, Syon 1, probably about here, just opposite the palace, and then in just reminding myself of the dates, 1426, the community, the Bridgettine community down at roughly this location, decided it was rather damp and horrible, and they would much rather move up to this location, which, as I mentioned, may have been the site of the aborted Celestine Monastery. So building work started at Syon 2, if I can call it that, in 1426, and by 1431 it was ready for occupation. It took quite a long while to build the abbey. The church wasn't ready for consecration until 1488. By contrast, Sheen Charterhouse was up and running within a few years. So just a few words about the Carthusian house, Sheen Charterhouse. The Carthusians were an odd bunch. They lived in glorious isolation most of the time in their own little individual houses, which each would have a garden as well, and its own lavatory. And they would only occasionally come together for communal prayer in the church, and also for communal meals occasionally in the refectory, but they took most of their food in their houses. So the best preserved example of this would be Mount Grace in Yorkshire, and here you can see two houses and two gardens, and there's a little loo here tucked away at the back of the garden. There would have been a sort of connecting passage along this side, and there would have been presumably another loo there. Now, Sheen Charterhouse didn't receive a great deal of attention until quite recently, but I was involved in excavations there, and we did locate part of the cloister, one of the houses, and then we located this lavatory. Obviously, the upper part is gone. There would have been a seat sort of somewhere up here at one time. And then we were able to locate the lavatory of the neighbouring house, neighbouring property, I suppose. So we were able to construct an entire cell, and that allowed us to reconstruct the layout of at least part of the monastery. So we have the house here, which we found remains of, the cloister, one loo there, the loo of the neighbouring cell here, and then because they were standard size cells, we were able to reconstruct the layout from then on. As you can see, when we superimposed a geophysical survey plot, it wasn't terribly clear, but with imposing our reconstruction on, you can see that there are some bits that seem to match. We've got a corner of a house there, and another sort of house showing up here, and also quite a lot of masonry around here. So it does make sense. And then over here, another survey by John Gator clearly defined a house and part of the cloister there. So nice reconstruction then of part of Sheen Charterhouse. So moving on to Syon Abbey, once they'd moved to the site that is now occupied by Syon House, building works carried on while the community was there. And as I mentioned, the church wasn't built for several decades, wasn't completed until several decades later. 1488 was the consecration. Burials in the church started in 1485. So I think it was already sort of functioning a few years earlier. Now, the historic landscape of Syon is incredibly rich. We have all sorts of things. There's a paleo channel, the origins of which date back some 50,000 years. That's marked now pretty much where Capability Brown's lakes, which were created in the mid-18th century. There's one there and the other one there. So the Paley Channel would have sort of looped around there and then connected up with the Thames. We also had, somewhat later, the Roman road to the west, which would lead from London to Silchester, a Roman settlement next to the Roman road, and Roman fields behind that. We have, of course, the medieval abbey, and then we have a sort of post-medieval system of fields and roads in this area here, a little late 16th century mansion here. So an awful lot going on, incredibly rich, and some fish traps nearby next to sort of up the historic core of Isleworth. It's just a reconstruction of the Roman settlement at Syon. So Syon House would be sort of down about here. So as for the archaeological investigations on the site of the Abbey, an awful lot's been done, but nearly all of it in the last, well, I suppose the earliest investigations would have been down on the River Thames in 1997. There was an initial survey by Thames Archaeological Survey. And also at the same time, John Gator undertook geophysical surveys in that year and in the following year. And those gave some very important clues for Time Team, who came along later. But you can see from the list of projects, there's quite a lot of work going on, and you can see also the Time Team trenches in grey here. Time Team Trench 1 there. Now the religious community, and I think I'm not going to, as I've had a couple of shots of sherry now, I'm not going to attempt the Swedish pronunciation of the full name of the saint that the order was named after. We could call her Birgitta or St. Bridget of Sweden, and let's leave it at that. I did actually look online how to pronounce her other name, and it's a real tongue twister, and I don't want to annoy any Swedish speakers who might see this. Anyway, there was a sort of standard complement for the communities. It was an unusual setup in that it was a double house, which was a rarity in the Middle Ages. You started getting double houses again with the Gilbertines in, I think it was from memory, 1200s. Certainly by the 15th century, that pretty much the male parts of those double houses have pretty much dwindled or completely disappeared. But we now have a sort of rebirth of this sort of double communities with the Bridgettines, and you would, with a full complement, have 85 individuals. This photograph here, I think, is taken. This is the Syon community who did actually, after the closure of the Abbey in 1539, they moved first of all to Flanders, then to France, then to Portugal, and then eventually they came back to England in the 19th century. And set up in South Brent in Devon. And they flourished there for many years, but certainly in the last few decades of the 20th century, their numbers dwindled. Here we have 9, and the numbers dwindled further, and in 2011, only 3 sisters were left. So it's rather sad. That was just before their 600th anniversary, which was obviously in 2015. So Time Team, first of all, very little survived of the Abbey. There are a few remnants here, possible remnants here and there above ground. But we didn't know where the church was. The assumption was that the quadrangle of Syon House replicated the position of, represented the position of the cloister, the nuns' cloister, and the Great Hall of Syon House. It was thought that was the site of their refectory. So that was the sort of traditional interpretation. However, Jonathan Foyle's, sorry, not Jonathan Foyle's, Gator's geophysical survey of the site indicated a number of sort of interesting features, some of which related to the Abbey, and others were obviously representing in a sort of rather ghostly outline the parterres and avenues of the sort of 17th, 18th, early 18th century formal garden. So anything that goes diagonally across here is definitely something to do with the gardens. This is in fact the south wall of the Abbey, and you can see Abbey Church, and you can see buttresses coming out here, and you can see the north wall of the Abbey Church here. Now you have to remember that up until this point, the assumption was that the nuns' cloister was here, and therefore people were thinking, well, the Abbey Church must be sort of down here somewhere. Anyway, Jonathan Foyle at a pre-shoot meeting, which I attended, and I'm not sure if Harvey attended that meeting.
No.
No, I think there was 4 of us. Anyway, Jonathan Foyle said this could be the north wall of the church, and this would be the south wall. And the reaction was, well, that's going to be an incredibly wide church, the widest medieval church known, in fact, in England. And he also suggested that it might even extend as far as the west front, to which I replied, well, you've got an undercroft here, which is supposedly contemporary with the Abbey. How would you explain that? An undercroft in the middle of a church, or at the west end of the church? It doesn't make sense. Anyway, the idea of this incredibly huge church stood when Time Team came to do the investigation a few months later. Some of you may recognize a very young Alice Roberts here, and this is Jonathan Foyle. So the first trench to go in, trench 1, was to locate the south wall and the north wall, and also it looked like we might have some pier bases, these sort of dark splodges. So we set about finding these. We certainly found that the south wall, we found that a pier base dead center, and so that was the north wall, and the south wall down here we found, and a dead center pier base, which was rather puzzling. Didn't find any evidence for arcade piers though. So anyway, this was the reconstruction that they came up with, a huge church that matches, or perhaps even, I don't know if it's larger in area, but it's certainly comparable with Westminster Abbey, much larger than Wells Cathedral, and certainly larger than your average parish church. I should mention this is Richard Palethorpe, the estate manager at Syon at the time, and he was instrumental at getting Time Team down. My heart sank when he mentioned Time Team, because I was always rather ambivalent, especially after the investigation that we did nearby at Richmond Palace. Another trench that we looked at, another trench that we opened to look at some of these dark splodges down here, particularly this thing here, that turned out to be what was interpreted as we knew it was something to do with a lavatory, because we could find these sort of latrine chutes going down into a brick structure, which was interpreted at the time as a great drain leading to the river, because that's what you would normally find in monasteries, great drains. We found out later that that was not entirely true. Up here we found a couple of female burials, and that started making us think that the nuns were located to the south of the church, whereas we know that traditionally Bridgettine nuns should be located to the north, and the male community would be located to the south. The idea being to segregate the communities. So anyway, there were clearly some interesting things. We knew that where the church was. We were a little bit puzzled about the central pier. So there were a number of excavations undertaken every summer by Birkbeck to try and establish a little bit more find out a little bit more about the layout of the religious house, and also details about its architecture. And the first area that we looked at was part of the church, and we started to pick up evidence for pier bases and also burial plots, brick-lined graves. And these we know from the records. There's a Syon Martelode, which is a record of various things to do with Syon, as well as information about martyrs. But one of the really useful things that it did was it lists the burials in the corridors that were constructed along the south side of the church, just inside the south side and just inside the north side of the church. We know from the records that there were 30 burial plots in each corridor. These were paired, so you had 15 pairs of burials. Now, the truncation by later gardening was such that quite a lot of this evidence had been destroyed. We found enough bits of mortar and the odd course of brickwork to reconstruct a fair bit. So a lot of this is not conjecture. It's based on good evidence, but very little skeletal remains. A few remains of the male community who were buried in the southern corridor, and a few remains of the female community in the northern corridor. And this is one of the massive buttresses that was actually first uncovered during the Time Team investigation. This is up in the northeast corner of the church. And we also have a sort of curious structure here in the corner, which is this thing here, and a similar one on the other side. And there was enough evidence from robber trenches and also partial remains of foundations to indicate that there was some rather unusual structure, I think a bridging structure, which would have supported an altar at the east end. Unusually, the high altar was placed towards the west end, and they had to get papal permission to do this, but that was granted. Just beyond the high altar was the brothers' choir. As for the nuns, they were segregated in the church as well. They had their own raised choir, which was supported by a whole series of piers, including a series of central piers here. So you had some arcade piers coming through along here, and you also had intermediary piers just to give it some extra support in this area. And then you had the 5 other piers that were additional to provide support to the raised choir for the nuns. So they worshipped separately. You had so effectively the nuns' choir was rather like a mezzanine floor overlooking the rest of the church, which you have a good example. This reconstruction of the Bridgettine church at Mariager in Denmark. You see the raised choir, and they would have actually, if they stood here, they would have had a good view of the high altar at the west end. This is just one of the pier bases that has been quite smashed around. And what they've done is they've simply to lower the gardeners have probably done this to reduce the level of the masonry structures so that there was no kind of parching of the gardens and so on that they were creating, and they just simply tumbled in the last bits of their sort of destructive activity, the rubble into this sort of pit around the pier base. So here we have the graves in the Sisters Passage, which is on the north, in the northern aisle of the church. Because we have the records in the Martyrologe, we were able to identify individuals who were buried in particular plots. So we were able to say that this was probably Johanna Spicer, who died in 1534. Not much of her remaining, but there's a little tile here, so possibly a rare example of a tile burial. Just patches of mortar surviving, showing where the walls of the brick-lined tomb were, and you've got a little bit of brickwork up here surviving. Over here, we've got slightly better preserved brick-lined graves, and these were in fact on the south side where the brothers were buried. And again, we were able to identify these: Oliver Parsons, who died in 1515 here, and Anthony Spencer here. There was one feature that we weren't entirely sure what it could be, but we thought it was probably the base of a funerary monument, which has been cut through by a later conduit for post-dissolution garden. Now, the Bridgettine churches often followed the layout of the mother house at Bridgettine in Sweden. This is the plan of the mother house up here, and this is our reconstruction of the church at Syon, with the raised choir for the nuns here. And we have a woodcut showing a sort of typical interior of a Bridgettine church. This is not quite how we'd see the layout at Syon, but there are lots of similarities. You've got a south corridor here where the brothers would have been buried. Shoulder high railings, we would have had those at Syon. We've got documentary evidence for that. On the north side, you would have the corridor where the nuns were buried. This is the raised choir, and you've got an altar at the east end of the church, and the high altar at the west end of the church, with a series of shallow steps with other altars rising up towards the high altar, and we have the brothers' choir just to the west of the high altar. As for architecture, we're well into the sort of perpendicular period, perpendicular Gothic. Henry V had died before the community moved to Syon II, and so it was left really to his son Henry VI and other benefactors, and there were lots of wealthy benefactors for the abbey, to see the completion of the church. We can imagine that it would be something like, in terms of architecture, something like Eton College, which was also built by Henry VI, and King's College, Cambridge, another church that was created by Henry VI. Or it might have been a little bit more like the mother house at Bedstena, which we see here. And this is Jonathan Foyle's reconstruction of the abbey. We would now say that it stops, it's at 5 bays rather than, I think it's got something like 10 bays here. So a bit shorter than Jonathan Foyle imagined. The sisters' buildings lay to the north of the church. So we have a south cloister here. We have a east range here, which has a sort of 3-meter wide cloister, another 3-meter wide cloister up here with rooms going off it. Possible location for chapter house here. To a certain extent, we're relying on the identification of the use of buildings, I should say, at Bedstena in Sweden. And the chapter house was located here, and therefore we're assuming that the chapter house sign may have been placed about here. So that's sort of our guesswork. Heavily buttressed on this side, so and there's some buttresses on this side as well. So we think that we would have a building, well, all of these buildings here would be at least 2 stories high. And then over here, a small enclosed area with a well, which may have been the convent garden. And then underneath it, we have also a drain. Underneath this building here, this range here, we have a drain. So here we have that buttressed cloister. You can imagine that there would have been windows placed in between these buttresses. And then over here, you would have had rooms that would lead off from the cloister. And this is just a view of the drain that underlay that range. Stonework used for the lower courses. I assume that the brickwork was placed just above the level, the highest level that water was likely to reach. And just a view of the buttresses of our possible chapter house. And then to the south, we have the brothers' accommodation. This possibly was a refectory. We're not entirely sure. There was something that projected out here that I thought might be part of the base of a stair, which in some monasteries would lead up to an opening at a higher level, at which a monk could read to people who are dining in the refectory. So that's one suggestion. Underneath this eastern range, we also had some drainage that led ultimately to a sump. Now here we had a mixture of male and female burials. The female burials are in green. Quite a lot of female burials. So not entirely sure quite what's going on here. It may be that we have laity who've made significant donations to the abbey who are being buried here. And this is just a view of this cloister here with all the graves. Just a few of them we weren't able to excavate, didn't have time. And then this is a view looking along the south cloister. This is the possible refectory off to the south. And there's a drain leading through here that connects up to this big drain. So that's this thing here. And a couple of burials, a female and a child. And a rather nice opening to the drain here. This is just at the edge of it's in the corner of the cloister garth. And we found in situ, this looks like a huge shovel for a very strong person, very strong archaeologist, but it is in fact a plate with a handle on it. And this plate, you can't see it here, but it's punctured by small holes that allow water to go through. And this is obviously to avoid leaves falling into this trap here and then going in and blocking the drain. So it's a sort of handy way of keeping the drain clear of gubbins. And this is the other end of that drain leading into a sump. And then as far as the latrines go, we weren't able to find the latrines for the ladies, but that would have been substantially bigger. This latrine, presumably for the brothers, would have served just 25 people. And it had 4 chutes. You can see that one clearly, and I think you can see this one clearly. And there's another one here and another one about here. Certainly during Time Team, when they lowered down, you can see the Time Team trench actually. Time Team trench came across here, and that's the infill bit of the Time Team trench. So they picked up one of these slots and they lowered down a camera. The latrine looks like it hadn't been emptied when it was last used. So you only have a space of about 2 or 3 feet of a void of about 2 or 3 feet in height, and then the arched roof. So that was all we could see, and you couldn't see very clearly to the end. It was just assumed that it carried on as a great drain. But we now know that it was in fact an isolated cesspit. And just to show the location of those square holes again, I think that might have been the year the portaloo wasn't ordered. And then to the west of the church, we have a number of features that we think probably are Abbey features, but we can't be absolutely certain. They could be the earliest phase of Syon House. But they include walls, and you could see the beginnings of sort of curving vault to some of these walls, and a wall here, which was thought to be a continuation of the church wall. It was very much deeper, and it was clearly faced as if it was facing an open area, a cellar. So it was part of a cellar. The foundations over here were far shallower, so it was clearly part of a completely different structure. And over here, the undercroft also is a likely Abbey survival, as were bits of wall and tile floor located in the garden quadrangle of Syon House. And this is part of what they thought was the church wall, but as I said, it's very much deeper and nicely faced. It wasn't just sort of crude rubble, which is what we are finding in the foundations elsewhere. So, and also a mark left by winter floodwater. So at one point, Richard Palethorpe's office, the estate manager's office, was just above here, and he said during the winter, if you opened the trap, you just see water down here. So probably not terribly healthy. This is just one of the bits of wall in the quadrangle, and there's another. I don't know if you can see. There's a tiny patch of tile in the corner there, glazed tile, yellow glazed tile. And more glazed tile was found under the fountain just before they built it. They uncovered this, and that's the undercroft, which may have been underneath a overlying hall. And geophysical surveys have indicated that there was actually quite a lot going on to the west of Syon House, and we think probably to do with the Abbey, but again, we can't be absolutely certain. This could be to do with the very earliest phases of Syon House. And certainly early plans, there's one plan here, possibly of about 1604, indicating you've got Syon House here, which we all know and love. Well, it's pretty much unchanged. And then we've got a range coming off, two ranges coming off the west side of Syon Abbey. And we see them also in pictures. So this is on the north side of the area and the south side. Other little hints of possible Abbey structures. There's a bit of a doorway, blocked-in doorway, just to the north of Syon House. Tiny area, really, of original brickwork. And the Abbey barn, again, a possible survival, much changed over the intervening centuries. But on one occasion, and it was just during a lunch break, during the training dig, we had about 40 minutes. Laurie, were you helping out on this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, Laurie and Sigrid. We got in there, we had about, I don't know, 40 minutes or so to clean up and photograph and make a very quick record, but it looks like we have foundations very much like the sorts of foundations we were finding on the side, on the Abbey site. Stonework down below, brickwork up above. This brickwork very much like the brickwork we were seeing on the site of the Abbey buildings to the east. And also evidence for the waterfront. They were first found in the late 1990s during the Thames Archaeological Survey. And we have cartographic evidence also for a channel coming back from the Thames. So we think this is part of the Abbey. We know there was a crane at the waterfront during the Abbey days. And we also now know pretty much where the conduit house that supplied water to the Abbey, where that's located, looking at historic maps. And I'm grateful to Laurie for pointing out to me the conduit house on the Moses Glover map, which I've looked at many times over the years and completely missed the conduit house. This is a drawing of that conduit house by George Bate, local historian. This would have come down in the early 1930s, and this is a still surviving example of a conduit house for Hampton Court. And this is just another example. This is a 17th century conduit house excavated a couple of years ago at Greenwich Park. This is our sort of interpretation of the layout, of the possible layout of the Abbey. As I said, we think this is the chapter house, refectory, possibly down here. This is Bad Stenner, but we think that this might be the wing with the refectory in. This might be the wing with the sisters' infirmary and the chapter house up here. If that makes sense. I think we'll just skip over the gory details there. and the even gorier details there. These are reconstructions by Victor Ambrose done during the Time Team programme. Quite disappointing as far as artifacts go from the site. It looks like they did a really good demolition job. They really broke up the stonework. Most of the usable brick and lead and stone, I think, was sort of sold off and used elsewhere, perhaps also in the building of Syon House. So we're left with not a great deal. Also, quite a lot of window glass, which, unlike they said during the Time Team programme that would be plain, but we can see here that it's not. We have a part of a Yorkist white rose with a sunburst, part of a building here. The legs of a person who's been crucified, part of someone's head, possibly a saint, foliage, and sort of architectural details. As for meeting the team, I mentioned, have I got time just to very quickly whiz through the team? Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, very supportive, particularly the Duke, who authorised, I think we had something like £17,000 to actually do the publication, which is actually, it's not much, but it was just enough. I don't know who this person here is, but we have Charlotte, who was a member of Mola. I don't know if she's back with Mola, but anyway, a Mola person there. And we had quite a few people from local societies and groups and volunteers. Some of these faces, I think, will be familiar to some of you. I think many of you will recognise Rosemary Yaxley. My wife's there. That's me. Scott McCracken, who was one of the tutors. Robin Denson, who was another tutor. Members of the Richmond Archaeological Society here. So we had these soirees, I think, once a season, as a sort of thank you from the people in the house. This chap keeps cropping up. And we have Scott McCracken again and Robin Denson. Those of you who work down at Syon may be familiar with Robin's particularly fancy headgear. It used to get some very hot at times, and there wasn't protection from the sun. The late, great Graham Kennan, I think he deserves a special mention for the wonderful talks he gave on finds to students. Richard Farrant, who looked after the finds and was also responsible for health and safety, and Becky Wallower of London Archaeologist fame, in fact, who also helped out with finds. Sue Trapman, who sometimes helped with human bones, and Little Ern, we couldn't have done without Little Ern, provided us with copious quantities of tea and coffee. And then just to finish off, two more slides, now and then. This was Toffer Martin, the head gardener, who was one of our sort of main points of contact. If we needed something really useful, he was a good man to go to. And some will recognise a slightly younger me there. What you might not recognise is that wearing something that looks suspiciously like a tea cosy is me, and this is Toffer Martin at Winchester Palace. And this is James Drummond Murray, who probably doesn't mean much to people now, but he's holding a piece of the inscription that was found at Winchester Palace. And this is a chap called Tom Saunders, who was the son of one of the chief inspectors many years ago, who I dug with down at Launceston Castle. And finally, health and safety was something that we used to bang on about a lot, at least Harvey did. I thought I should end with a slide that shows the correct usage of the wheelbarrow. Funny enough, actually, I did write a talk about the safe use of wheelbarrows for Mola. So there you go. So fun and games at Syon. Thank you.
Oh, happy days.
Right, well, thank you very much, Rob. That brings back a few memories of warm summers,
Indeed.
amongst other things.
Very hot summers sometimes.
See a young Robin in a wheelchair there, I mean a barrow.
Yeah, I was cheating there. That Robin, that photograph I think was taken elsewhere. But
It was a regular occurrence.
It's not unfamiliar, but I agree with Jane. Yes.
These two are side shots. You can see in the back.
Questions, anyone? These two are just going to go on all night. Questions.
Yes, if you'd like to look for any from anyone who's joining us from a distance, Jane, shall I ask the audience if anyone would like to ask anything to Bob from here while we sort of that. So, yes.
Can I ask, is there anything to explain why the